product development, and it's presented by RTreitel. Go ahead, click to the next slide, Lori. ISBM was founded in 1982 as a collection of leading academics from institutions around the globe, and they partnered with a few B2B companies at that time because we all recognized that there was very little B2B market research being done. Today, we're about 40 member firms that learn from each other and from the 29 academic fellows that we've named since that time, and a whole lot of B2B instructors and partners that teach courses and present with us, including Richard. Next slide. Today, you're going to be hearing from RTreitel. He's there on the left, and you're listening to the disembodied voice of Lynn Yanyo, the Executive Director of ISBM. I'm so glad you're here. In 2 more weeks, I'll get my hair done again, and you might all see me. Next slide. So let's talk about how you interact with us while you're on this webinar. So if you haven't been in Zoom yet, oh my goodness, where have you been over the last few months? But here we are. And in this format, in the webinar format, you'll be able to ask questions through the Q&A notch there. So click on the Q&A and you can type your questions in. So we don't have any audio for this. And Lynn, will be monitoring those questions as they come in. And if I'm really clever, I'll be able to get Richard's attention and he'll answer questions as they come, or I'll send you a note back and say, we're gonna ask that at the end. If you have any questions about what we're doing, just feel free to type those in there too. Lori and I are monitoring the Q&A chat window. And everybody wants to know if they can see this. So yes, if you go anywhere in the next 3 months after this, you'll have a link and you'll be able to see this webinar. If you're a member, you'll be able to see the webinar forever and ever because it's in B2B Pulse, which is our exclusive repository for B2B research. And if you're not a member, well, you'll have to talk to me and see if you can wheedle that out of me after 3 months. But either way, you'll be able to see it. And if you're a member company and you haven't been in Pulse, please go there and register. Or if you have questions, just contact Lori or Lynn. You'll see our names at the end. Here's our leadership team. I'm Lynn Yanyo. You probably met Rand Mendez. He's our membership director. Becky Williams has been creating our curriculum and recreating our curriculum over the last several months. So everything that we had that was a physical course where you went to it is now online, and we're offering those. I hope you'll check those out. Stefan is on the research side, and then Lori didn't want to be talked about, so she clicked over that. We have a whole bunch of fellows, some people that are the names in B2B research. Abby Griffin, the inventor of Voice of the Customer, for example, they're all on our roster and there to help you. We also have a whole collection of, next slide, Lori, member firms, and here's just a smattering of their logos just to see who those firms are. And then the next slide. Upcoming events. So I want to remind you that we've been hosting a town hall almost every week. We're now going to every other week, and the next one is June 3rd, where we're going to have folks talking about the agency-client relationship and how that's changing in the current environment. And then we will have another one on June 17, which is the building rapport without face-to-face, right? Okay, and then today we have our webinar. So let's talk about those courses that I just mentioned we completely redid. So these courses are now multiple days, a few hours per day with some things in between in terms of doing research. They're also priced differently. And of course, you physically don't have to go anywhere. We have Creating Competitive Advantage with High Value Solutions and VOC in the Age of COV. And those two are now in August or September. We're rescheduling them. We had them coming up in the next 2 weeks, but that was just too early for most people to take advantage of. Value in Use Pricing by Joanne Smith is really competitive. You want to get in on that one if you want to. She's got signups going great. And Liam Fay is doing competitor analysis, and Bob Cooper, the inventor of StageGate, is going to be talking about changes in that and to win in new products in this current environment as well. So please feel free to go to isbm.com and you can see those and sign up. Next one. Oh, that's the end of that. So now we're going to put slides up for Richard, and I'm going to introduce him. So I've known Richard for so long I don't even want to say, but the unit of measure is in decades. And Richard has helped me out with things that I have done when I've needed to do market research. And he has this really positive statement about B2B market research best practices. But you know, the flip side of best practices is we all learn from our mistakes. So these are all things we should be very cautious about as we choose to do our market research and how it gets done, because there are some things to step into that you want to avoid, right? And so Richard has done, I don't know, 400 or so presentations and research projects for people, and he's been doing this for a very, very long time. And he's very clever about getting people who might not ever answer the question to answer questions on your behalf, which I found very valuable. So I'm going to turn it over to Richard, who you'll be able to watch this whole time. Feel free to readjust your Zoom screen to see more of Richard and less of his slides, or however you like, and feel free to play around with that. And then I'm going to pass it over to you, Richard. I'll be on mute unless I have a question.
Great, thank you very much, Lynn. And I'd like to wish, depending which time zone you're in, either a good morning or a good afternoon to everyone here who's attending the webinar. Laurie, let's move over to the next PowerPoint. Thank you very much. Here's our table of contents. We're going to start by defining market research, because we're going to talk about best practices when it comes to efficient product development and market research's role in that. We need to define market research. So we'll spend a moment on that. We'll spend a moment talking about market research and specifically its role in new product development. We'll spend a slightly longer moment on market research and its role in why new products fail or succeed. And then we'll spend the bulk of this particular webinar on errors in B2B market research and how to avoid them. And that's what I propose spending most of our time on. Let's start, though, with a fairly quick one. Thank you, Laurie. Appreciate that, on the definition of market research. Now, what I should share with you straight off is, before developing this webinar, I went to look online to try to find a definition of market research. And there are an immense number of definitions out there. The trouble is that from our perspective, most of them are inadequate. And the reason is not because they're badly drafted or badly written. It's because most of them are consumer oriented. Most of the definitions out there online assume that we're B2C people. And when it comes down to looking for a definition that's suitable for us in the B2B world, there is a lot smaller palette of choices. The best one that I could find is this classic one from the American Marketing Association. Now, I'm not going to submit you to my reading this PowerPoint. That would be a cruel and unusual punishment. But rather, I'm going to do is as follows. This definition has its pluses and minuses. The pluses are, it's a valid definition. Market research clearly is, and I bolded this, the function that links the customer to the marketer through information. And it's certainly true, as it says here, that we use market research to understand, identify and define marketing opportunities and problems, and that's relevant to us in the product development field. To generate, refine, and evaluate marketing actions, that's again relevant to us, and so forth and so on. So at that sense, at that level, this is a very good definition. Yet this definition also has its minuses, and the minuses, unfortunately, are quite significant. And what is the problem with this definition? It's pretty simple. It's a definition only an academic could love. I'm not going to read it to you, as I said before, because I find every time I try to read it to myself, my eyelids started to droop, my eyes glaze over. It's just incredibly boring. And I find it unfortunate that in an area, a topic such as marketing, a great definition of market research should have so little pizzazz to it. Now, if this were a session, let's say on accounting, that would be perfectly fine. But in market research, I'm hoping for something better. But it is what it is, and it certainly is valid. So let's take a look at the next PowerPoint. As we say on the next PowerPoint, this definition is valid, and it's particularly relevant to us because market research, as it says, links the customer to the market, and it's used to identify and define marketing opportunities and problems. And for both reasons, market research is crucial for new product development. And that's all I want to say about the academic piece of this seminar, so let's move on to the next PowerPoint. Now, the reality is new products fail. Large numbers of new products fail. There's a classic article back in January 2008 Harvard Business Review in which the researchers who wrote the article stated that 75% of new products fail. If any of you guys are fans of the late Clay Christensen, who wrote The Innovator's Dilemma and The Innovator's Solution, he claimed that 75% of the money spent on market research is spent on products that flop. Not quite the same thing as 75% of new products fail, but still certainly worth knowing. And the question then comes, why do new products fail? And the answer is there are 4 reasons why they fail. The first one is a market issue, and that breaks down to 2 subcategories. One is we did inadequate market research, and the other, of course, is we do a poor job of marketing. And clearly, even if you have a great product, you've done great market research. If we as marketers don't let customers know about the product's existence and what it can do for them, it'll still flop. But let me go back to market research, because that's, after all, the focus of this particular webinar. There are many examples of new products that should never have been launched because, lamentably, the company that offered them didn't bother to carry out basic market research. Let me give you an example here from Google and the sad story of Google Radio. Now, Google Radio, despite the name, is not an attempt by Google to compete with Spotify or what have you. Rather, Google Radio is trying to deal with a very simple but powerful problem. Most people, when they listen to radio, do so while driving. And you've got a variety of different channels that are offered to you for free. So how do the radio networks make money? And the answer, of course, is they embed advertisements into the music, whatever else it is you happen to be listening to. And that's fine. The problem is the process of buying the advertising is a bit of a dark art. Media buyers from media buying agencies or from advertising agencies contact the radio network by phone or by email. And they basically say, look, I've got an advertiser who wants to buy the following number of people, the following geographics and the following demographics. How much will it cost? There's some negotiation online or by phone, but in essence, the media buying agency is at a disadvantage because they know how much they have paid for similar similar advertising. They don't know how much other agencies are paying. And this gives the radio networks an advantage. And whenever that happens in that kind of non-transparent market, you tend to see higher prices than you might get otherwise in a transparent market. But again, you sometimes find the media buyer says that's too expensive and the sponsor decides to spend the money someplace else. And that's fine. Now, Google's idea, and it seemed like a good idea at the time, was to set up an auction market whereby the radio networks could auction unsold spot advertising on radio. And they thought this would be great. This way, the radio networks would generate more money because whatever money they got be more than the zero they're getting from unsold advertising. And equally, it'd be great from the perspective of the media buyers because they'd look like heroes because they could buy advertising at a lower cost. The trouble is Google was so convinced this idea would succeed, they didn't bother to carry out any market research at all. And they blew through $100 million as a result. It so happened, had they carried out the market research, that have found out that Google Radio is of no interest either to media buyers, nor for that matter, to the radio networks. From the radio networks, there are two problems with Google's idea. Firstly, it means that media buyers would know how much advertising should actually cost, which would lower their margins. But secondly, the radio networks would sooner sell a small amount of advertising at a high price than a larger amount of advertising at a low price. Because what happens if they have too much advertising? The people who are listening to the radio will simply switch channels to something else, and then they get no listeners, and shortly after that, no money at all. The media buyers weren't interested. The media buyers are recompensed for getting the buy done as quickly as possible. If they have to keep going back and back on an auction process and then do it for each individual ad, it would take forever. And this is no interest to them either. Well, if Google Radio is of no interest to the radio networks and no interest to media buyers, it was of no interest to anyone, and it flopped. Now, the only thing I can say in Google's failure is while it costs them $100 million, from Google's perspective, $100 million is not real money. It's pocket change. They can probably find that much at Google buried under the couch. So from their perspective, it was no big deal. But me, I'm old-fashioned. To me, $100 million still seems like real money. And I can't help thinking Google could have saved most of that $100 million had they carried out market research. So market research can clearly kill new products. Technology, I think we're all familiar with the fact that inadequacies when it comes to technology can doom a new product. I could definitely talk about that, but since that would be off topic and ISBM's only given me an hour to play with, we'll save that for another time. Operations. I'm using a very broad definition of operations here. That means anything other than marketing and market research and anything other than technology, i.e. engineering, R&D, etc. So that means anything from IT to manufacturing to supply chain to quality assurance, you name it, all the other functions we need to run a business. And the reality is inadequate quality assurance will doom a new product. So will manufacturing problems. So will supply chain issues. So will any of the various other areas. Again, could talk more about that. We could easily spend an hour on that topic alone, but we'll have to save that for another occasion. And lastly, finance. Even if we have a new product for which there clearly is a market, a large market, and we do a great job of marketing and the technology works really well and operationally we can deliver, if we can't make money off it and we're in the for-profit sector, we've got a problem, an insuperable problem. And in the end, if we fail on that one, then the product will fail. And so, ladies and gentlemen, that's a quick run through why new products fail. Now let's move over to the next PowerPoint and focus a little more deeply at market research itself. What I've developed here is a mnemonic, surf and turf, the classic restaurant combination, if you like, which I use to define the 12 reasons or 12 errors in B2B market research, why new products fail due to market research related causes and how to avoid them. And that is what I propose spending the rest of this webinar on. So let's take a look at the next PowerPoint and start with the very first one, which is going to be not surveying the real decision makers. Unfortunately, all too often, I've seen valiant market research efforts that fail because the company that carried out the market research failed to identify the real decision makers. Now, in a B2C world, that's much less of a problem because there aren't that many people you have to worry about to determine who's a decision maker, who's an influencer, and who's not relevant if you're surveying individual consumers. In the B2B world, as we all know, this is a real challenge. It is not always easy to identify who the decision makers are, who the influencers are, and who, frankly, is less relevant from the point of view of deciding whether or not the company is going to buy our new product. And there are many great companies that have fallen into that trap. And the example I'd like to share with you comes from 3M. Now, my purpose in sharing this example is not to suggest that 3M is inadequate when it comes to market research, but rather to suggest that even 3M, well managed though it is, can make this kind of blooper. In this particular case, I'm going to talk about surgical gowns. 3M, until recently, has a unit that makes disposable surgical gowns, and that's fine. It's a fine market. And what 3M realized is that there's a little problem with surgical gowns, and they found this out from market research. What they found when surveying surgeons and anesthesiologists and nurses and so forth is the problem with surgical gowns is they work too well. Surgical gowns are designed to prevent anything from crossing through the barrier. And that, of course, ensures that a patient who's cut open on an operating table, when the skin's cut open, they're very vulnerable to infection, won't be infected by the surgeon or the nurse or the anesthesiologist or anyone else in the operating theatre, but equally it protects the medical staff from being infected by the patient. And so it's of value to everyone in an operating room. The problem is it works so well, it doesn't let anything through, including water vapor. And as a result, in the course of a long procedure, particularly under the hot lights, sweat starts to build up inside the surgical gown. Now, I'm not suggesting a patient has ever died because a surgeon had sweaty armpits, but it does become physically uncomfortable. And what 3M realized is it could make surgical gowns out of a Gore-Tex-like material that would be impermeable to everything except for water vapor. Now, this material will be significantly more expensive, and as a result, to make money, they'd have to double the price of the surgical gowns. And so before setting up a manufacturing line, 3M very reasonably thought it would carry out market research. And it surveyed surgeons and nurses across the country. The results were clear. In fact, they were overwhelming. Surgeons and nurses loved the idea of these new breathable surgical gowns, and they couldn't wait for them. And so 3M set up the manufacturing line. Only to discover when they launched the product, it flopped dismally. No one was buying them. And of course, the reason was quite simple. 3M had surveyed influencers. They hadn't surveyed the decision makers. Because the decision makers when it comes to surgical gowns are not surgeons, and it's not nurses. It is, of course, the hospital administrators. And they saw no reason to pay twice the price when the current surgical gowns worked just fine. 3M did its best. They tried, in that case, to persuade the health insurers, persuade more for the breathable surgical gowns. But the health insurers had no more interest in paying more for the surgical gowns than the hospital administrators did. And 3M was forced to close down the manufacturing line and remained at the surgical gowns. It's not the only example I can share with you. There are many more. But again, make sure you've identified the real decision makers. Our next issue is going to be forgetting that customers unintentionally lie. I'm not saying deliberately lie, although I suppose that could happen, but unintentionally lie. And there are a number of reasons why customers unintentionally lie. The first reason is sometimes customers can't articulate what they think or do. And so, for example, JCB is a large UK-based manufacturer of construction equipment, backhoes in particular, but other equipment as well. And one of the things that JCB has found is that if you ask people who use a backhoe or any other equipment, what they go through step by step in using the backhoe, people can't articulate that. People just operate a backhoe on autopilot. And the same thing's true, of course, if I'm, say, developing a pivot table in Excel. I do it. I don't think about how I do it step by step. I just do it on autopilot. I've done it often enough, it flows automatically. And I'm sure the same thing is true for all of you as well. And so that is a challenge for market researchers. Sometimes customers don't know the steps they go through, what they think while they're doing it. But other times, more fundamentally, customers can know that, but they don't know what they want. They think they know what they want, but they're mistaken. And a great example of that, ladies and gentlemen, comes from StubHub. 2013, 7 years ago, StubHub carried out some market research. And they found out that customers who were buying its tickets didn't like, in fact, they strongly did not like the fact that StubHub, just like Ticketmaster, charges, or I should say, offers a low price for a ticket. At the very end, just before you buy the ticket, then slaps on all sorts of other and quite massive additional fees. And customers did not like that. And they would much prefer it if StubHub just named the price up front with no additional charges. So armed with that information, StubHub switched from a low initial price, then fees slapped on at the end, to one price that covers everything. Ticketmaster, of course, had not carried out the same market research, and so they continued on with their previous method of pricing, with a low price for a ticket, for a sports event or a concert event or what have you, or a theatre event, and then a high price at the end once you factor all the additional charges that show up at the last minute. What happened? Customers are looking at the same events on StubHub versus Ticketmaster, found that StubHub always seemed to be much more expensive. So they bought less and less from StubHub and more from Ticketmaster. And StubHub's market share over the next 2 years dwindled from 65% down to 50%. Still a strong position, but less than it was before. In 2015, StubHub had enough of this, and they carried out beta testing. They did classic A/B testing. One set had a server with the then StubHub method of high price, but no extra charges. The other, the method they'd used previously, low price and massive charges at the end. The results weren't even close. With 1 hour, they'd found that customers much preferred an initial low price and then massive charges at the end. Customers had been lying to them when they carried out the market research. Again, not intentionally lying. They said what they genuinely believed to be true. But what we as customers believe to be true isn't always so. The other reason, by the way, why customers lie to us is they want to be nice to us. One of the things we all learn at a young age is to be nice with other kids and play nicely with other kids in the sandbox. Therefore, we are nice to market researchers. And that means we say nice things if we think we know who's sponsoring the market research, which we don't always mean. And we'll come back to that particular issue a bit more detail later on, and a real issue it is too. But certainly customers do lie to us, and there's not much we can do about it. The next one, actually there is, what we can do about it is A/B testing. What can we remember? Importance is rarely important. What do I mean by that? We very often in market research will carry out qualitative market research to find out what variables matter to customers when they're buying or using a product. And so, for example, if I'm carrying out market research on solder, or solder as we call it in my native country, you'll find out the variables that matter include things like electrical conductivity, thermal conductivity, purity, its rheology or flow, etc., etc. And that's fine. We're pretty good about doing that. We then find out how we and our competitors rate on each of these variables. And we can easily find out how we all rate on each one of these variables. And that's quantitative market research, and that's pretty good. The other thing we often do at this point in time is, okay, we know how we rate on each variable, but clearly not all variables are equal. Some are more important than others. So why don't we ask our customers, how important each variable is. How important is electrical conductivity? How important is the purity? And we can do that, and we often do that. The trouble is that academic research shows that customers' responses to those questions are rarely valid. People think they know how important importance is. They don't get it right. And as a result, we may find ourselves putting a lot of effort into variables we think are important, but in fact really aren't from a customer perspective. They just haven't told us that, and vice versa. So how do we deal with that issue? If you don't have a lot of money, the simple approach is to use gambling chips or monopoly money. Give customers, say, $100 in gambling chips or monopoly money, and ask them to allocate the money across the different variables that affect their decision to buy or use the product. This forces trade-offs into the customer decision. They cannot say that every variable is equally important. And what happens as a result is that customers, for some reason, as a result, tend to give better answers. Not great answers, but better answers. Can we do better still than that? And the answer is yes, we can. And what I strongly recommend here is using max diff. Now, max diff is short for maximum differential scaling. It's a market research technique that was originally developed in Australia at the University of Sydney and became popular in academic circles about 20 years ago and started to become much used in business circles about 10 years ago. And for those of you who are not yet familiar with max diff, here's how it works if you are an interviewee in a max diff survey. What will happen is the interviewer will pick 4 of the variables or attributes at random and say, of these 4, which is the most important and which is the least important? Don't tell me number 2 and number 3, and if you tell me, I'm not going to record the data, but do tell me the most important and the least important. And so I might say, therefore, the most important is to me is electrical conductivity, and the least important is purity, or whatever answer I might give. As an interviewer, you answer that question, you then get another similar question, once again, 4 attributes. Now what happens is, the interviewer is picking those 4 attributes at random from the list of different attributes or variables that we know matter to customers. And it keeps on, you keep getting asked this question as an interviewee until every variable has appeared in the answers at least twice. At that point, we can cut the market research and move to the number crunching. And for those who are interested in how the number crunching works, we use a classic hierarchical Bayesian analysis to determine the implicit weighting or importance behind each variable or for each variable for customers to have given the answers that they gave. Now, you as market researchers don't need to know how the numbers are crunched. You just need to know as follows. Academic research shows that max diff shows a remarkably good correlation with R-squareds up in the 90s between the results of max diff and subsequent customer behavior. In other words, I'm recommending max diff for the best of all possible reasons because it works. Now, you don't have to have a good knowledge of statistics or someone on your staff who does. It's nice if you do, because there are plenty of online packages that will do this all for you on a turnkey basis. Depending on your sophistication in statistics, you can use everything from Excel Stat or Qualtrics to Q Research or R or Sawtooth software, which I'm familiar with. They typically cost anything from $500 to $2,000 per year for a license. The cheaper ones do rely on you do quite a bit of a number crunching. The more expensive packages will generate the questions for you, do the number crunching and spit out the answers for you. They're very user-friendly, at least the more expensive ones are. But again, $2,000 a year is not exactly a lot of money. And the less expensive ones, of course, are also a lot of fun. And what I recommend is doing that. But I want to emphasize importance is rarely important. And this is a bit of a challenge because there are a number of research techniques that are quite popular today in the new product development field, such as new product blueprinting and outcomes analysis, which assume that we can ask customers how important a variable attribute or problem is to them, and the customer's answers will be valid. Word of warning, if you're using any of those kinds of techniques, such as new product blueprinting, use max diff to get a proper understanding of the importance of each variable. Otherwise, you're going to end up in kind of tricky. And now for my final one on this particular PowerPoint, and that's using focus groups. Now, a lot of people use focus groups, they're widely used. And here's my advice when it comes to the results of any focus group you may ever have conducted or will conduct. Take the results from the focus group, print them out on a piece of paper, scrunch the piece of paper up into a ball and throw it out into the closest waste paper basket. And that is the best use you can make of the results of focus groups. Focus groups are wonderful, but they have no validity whatsoever. I wouldn't touch them with a 10-foot pole. The only reason there could possibly be for carrying on market research is two, or actually two reasons. One is because your boss has told you to and you have no choice. The other is because you want to create the illusion of carrying out market research, but don't really want to do it. Now, some of you are probably thinking, whoa, 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 Rich, what on earth are you saying? We've been using focus groups for years. You can't be serious. And the answer is yes, I am. And let me share with you why focus groups are so grossly inadequate as a market research techniques. Let's start with quantitative. We all know, and we're all taught in business school way back when, is you cannot use focus groups for quantitative research. You can't simply, as the phrase goes, count noses and see what percentage of a market will buy a proposed new product. It simply doesn't work. So, okay, I can't use it for quantitative research. What about qualitative? Well, in a B2B environment, you can't have customers who compete against each other in the same focus group because they'll clam up. They'll be reluctant to share anything that might be of value to their competitors. Well, fair enough. I either won't ask questions that might cause them to clam up, or I'll make sure the people in the group don't directly compete against each other. I'll deal with that issue on the qualitative side. That way I'll get them to work. Well, I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, even that won't work. And the problem goes down to something that social scientists call cascades, or people who aren't social scientists call groupthink. And there are two kinds of cascades that are relevant to focus groups. One is informational cascades, and the other is reputational cascades. And in order to share an example of both informational and reputational cascades, let me give you a classic social science study that looks at a focus group and why it fails. It's a particular kind of focus group. It's called jury duty. And jury duty is, in the end, a form of focus group, which are trying not to develop new products. Instead, we're trying to find out, is someone guilty or innocent for crime? And that's perfectly fine, a perfectly good thing to do. And in this particular case, it happens to be a pretty serious case. It was a murder case. The researchers were allowed to interview the jurors individually, one-on-one, after they'd heard all the evidence and the arguments in the courtroom, but before they went into the jury room. Now, juror number one was convinced the defendant was guilty. And he articulated to the researchers why the defendant was guilty and all the good reasons why the defendant was guilty. And that's perfectly fine. He's certainly entitled to that opinion after hearing the evidence and the arguments. Juror number two had a different take on things. He was on the fence. He could see good arguments on both sides and hadn't yet made up his mind. And he articulated to the researchers the arguments on both sides and why he had not yet made up his mind. Juror number three, same as juror number two. Again, on the fence, could see good arguments on both sides, which he laid out to the researchers and was still waiting to make his mind up. Juror number four, her view is very clear, innocent. She had heard, of course, exactly the same evidence and the same arguments as the previous three jurors, but as often the case in a jury, she had come to a very different conclusion. And she articulated to the researchers why, in her view, the defendant was clearly innocent. Now, all the jurors walk into the jury room. Juror number one spoke first and said guilty and articulated why the defendant was guilty. And he laid out the same arguments had done to the researchers in terms of why the defendant was clearly guilty. Now for juror number two. Juror number two at this stage has heard only one fellow juror speak. And that juror had stated guilty and articulated a case why the defendant was guilty. And when that happens, there's something called an informational cascade. If we haven't made our mind up, as we hear more information, it can cause us to move off the fence and come down on one side in favor of the arguments made by the person who spoke first. In other words, the person who speaks first in a focus group or jury duty has an outsized influence on everyone else. And that's an informational cascade. A reputational cascade, as I said earlier on, we all learn at a very young age to play nicely with other kids, not to hurt other kids' feelings. And we continue doing this as adults. And this is, of course, a very good thing. It leads to a much more harmonious and happier society. But boy, does it mess up focus groups. Because whenever someone else speaks first, we wish to agree with them, or at the worst, not disagree. People who disagree with other people in group meetings are said to be difficult to work with, or worse still, not a team player. And that, of course, is the kiss of death in most environments. And so whether it's an informational cascade or a reputational cascade, juror number 2 got off the fence and said guilty and restated the arguments made by juror number 1. Now for juror number 3. Juror number 3 has now heard 2 jurors speak, and both of them said guilty and stated the same reasons why the defendant was guilty. What did juror number 3 say? Guilty. And he re-articulated or restated the arguments made by the first 2 jurors. Now for the interesting one, in my opinion, and that's juror number 4. Remember, juror number 4 has gone into the room convinced the defendant was guilty. Sorry, innocent, my apologies. But she'd heard 3 jurors say guilty and articulate the same arguments why the defendant was guilty. What did juror number 4 say? Guilty. And she restated the arguments made by the first 3. Now, this was a webinar on the criminal justice system. There's doubtless a great deal we could talk about. This is a webinar on market research and its relation to product development. And I'm afraid to say this really does condemn focus groups. Now, I know every moderator I've ever met claims that statement, what you've told me is true, Rich, but I am the one moderator who can deal with that issue. Every moderator who says that is lying. There's nothing that could be done about this because this is fundamental to human nature. We're social animals, and as a result, focus groups do not work, period. There are many techniques we can use. For example, we can interview people one-on-one, and that works just fine. But don't, for heaven's sake, use focus groups. Okay, let's take a look now at the next PowerPoint and see what we've got over there. Not applying enough interpretation and creativity to the results. What I want to say is as follows. Customers can tell us as market research the problems they're running into, the difficulties they're facing, challenges, whatever word you want to use. They can't always give us the solution that we should be using. It's up to us as marketers, as business executives, say, okay, this is a problem that customers have. What is the appropriate solution? And a good example of this comes from a company I've done a number of projects for, and that's Pratt & Whitney. Pratt & Whitney, based up in East Hartford, Connecticut, of course, is a major manufacturer of airplane engines. And one of the things they found out from market research is that the airlines were complaining over the course of an airplane engine's lifetime, toxic black sludge starts to develop on the inside of the airplane engine. It's caused by partially burnt jet fuel. And as that sludge gets thicker and thicker, the airplane engine becomes less and less fuel efficient, which the airlines don't like, and it runs hotter, which speeds up the time for the next time the airplane engine has to be taken out for service, which Pratt & Whitney doesn't like. And this it's clear from their research, was a real challenge for the airlines. What the airlines had done historically was simply use a fire hose and spray water into the jet engine and watch a mixture of water and toxic sludge, in other words, polluted water, come out onto the airplane tarmac and leak into the groundwater by the airport. The trouble is that people who live near airports didn't like this very much because it polluted the groundwater, and they complained to their elected representatives. And so airport after airport in this country started to ban the practice. Now, initially, this wasn't a problem. You know, for example, JFK banned it, just use O'Hare, you get the idea. But as airport after airport banned it, this became less and less practical. Why can't you just use airports in other countries where it's still legal? Well, you could, but there are certain moral and ethical issues that come into play, which the airline executives found, shall we say, made them very uncomfortable. And so they asked, that is the problem. What they couldn't articulate was a solution because they hadn't come up with that. But fortunately for the airlines, Pratt & Whitney came out with a solution with the incredible, the amazing Echo Power truck. And what is the Echo Power truck? It's a truck that looks like a fire engine. And if you take the fire truck or fire engine over to the airplane, a hose comes out that sprays water into the engine. But at the back, something comes out that's a large sheet of metal, it's like a slide, that catches the water as it comes out of the engine and funnels it into a wastewater tank. And so none of the water ends up in the tarmac or the groundwater. And then Pratt & Whitney, having cleaned the engines for an airline, can then drive away and dispose of the polluted water in an ethical and legally sensitive fashion. The Echo Power truck has been phenomenally successful. The airlines love it because it solves a real problem. But the point I want to make here is the airlines didn't come up with a solution. It's up to Pratt & Whitney to interpret the results and apply creativity to come up with a solution. And it's our challenge as marketers to interpret the results, apply creativity, and come up with a solution that works. Did Pratt & Whitney test the solution before going live? Of course they did. And that's exactly the right thing to do, beta testing. Now for the next one on my list, poor use of hunches. Now you could make an argument, and I've heard people say this to me, this poo, you don't need market research. After all, I'm just like Steve Jobs, and he famously said, customers don't know what they want until we've shown them. And if truth be told, if any of you are as brilliant as Steve Jobs, all I can say is God bless you. And that's absolutely wonderful. You don't need to carry out market research. For the rest of us who are mere mortals, I encourage you to use hunches. And I'd like to go back to JCB once again. Anthony Bamford, who's chairman of JCB, has been quoted as saying, there has to be, sorry, my apologies. I think market research has some value, but not total value. There has to be some room for hunches on products from which you then do market research. And I think that's true. Sometimes we have to use our creativity to come up with hunches and then see if they actually work. And a great example of this comes from Camelback. Now, many of you are probably familiar with Camelback. They make backpacks that contain water and you can then use while bicycling or hiking or whatever else you wish to do. But I'm going to talk about their use in the military. It was invented, Camelback was invented by Michael Eaton, who was an avid cyclist. But at some point he hired as SVP of sales and marketing a general called Chuck Hunter. And Chuck Hunter had a couple of friends who were Navy SEALs. And historically, Navy SEALs had used heavy canteens of water attached to their waist. And these were painful because they kept bumping against their legs, but they were necessary. And what these Navy SEALs had done is they purchased out of their own money some Camelbacks to replace the canteens. And what Chuck Hunter thought was, well, if these two people had done it from their own money, maybe there'll be real demand for this in the military. And that was his hunch. What Chuck Hunter then did was market research to see if there might be demand for Camelbacks in the military. It turned out not only was the demand there, but it was overwhelming. They had to make some changes. For example, Camelback had to produce a slim line Camelback that could fit under body armor. So if someone's hit by shrapnel, they won't lose all their water. But with the necessary modifications, the demand is so great that these days, about half of their sales are to the military, rather than the traditional cyclists, hikers, and what have you, that were their original market. So use hunches just as Camelback did, and then carry out market research on those hunches. The next one I have here is not keeping marketing beta testing separate from real beta testing. A little bit of a challenge, you've got to be careful of this one because we carry out two kinds of beta testing. One kind of beta testing is what I call real beta testing. That's when we're trying to find out, is there really a demand for this product in the marketplace? And that's a fine and excellent thing to do. The other kind of beta testing is done close to launch. We're not really interested in finding out if there's demand because we know there's demand by this stage. Rather, what we're trying to do is get endorsers on board, people that endorse the product, people we can quote on our website, on our literature, speak at webinars, at trade shows when they come back again, or in virtual trade shows right now, industry symposia, what have you. People who will go online and say great things about our new product. That's a different kind of beta testing. We're trying to identify and develop endorsers. And that's not the same thing as real beta testing. What I've seen companies that confuse the two and assume that marketing beta testing is the same thing as real beta testing when it's not. It's done on a different audience for a different purpose with different results. What I can say is if you're doing a marketing beta test and you get negative feedback, you almost certainly have a problem, because if your expected endorsers don't like it, something is not right. Next one, not getting internal buy-in. We need to get internal buy-in, both to carry out the market research and to use the market research. And that's going to be pretty important for the rest of 20 and possibly into 21, given the current situation. Clearly budgets have been cut, and I understand that, and there'll be a lot of pressure to keep market research expenses as low as possible. The problem is that means you end up flying blind, and that could be a lot more expensive, not carrying out the market research. So you have to try and get internal buy-in to allow you to continue doing the market research. The other challenge is using the results. And lamentably, as a consultant, I have seen occasions, thankfully not often, where the company has made it clear to me there's a particular result they want from the market research. If that's the result they get, great. If not, the market research will be buried. Those companies will remain nameless, but I have seen this happen more than once, and it is, of course, most unfortunate and definitely not a good approach to market research. Can't endorse that one. So make sure you get internal buy-in, both for carrying out the market research and for using it. Now let's take a look at our next and final PowerPoint. And in terms of errors to market research, thank you very much. Appreciate your courtesy there. Type 1 errors. You're probably all familiar with type 1 and type 2 errors. For those who need just a quick refresh, type 1 errors occur when we get a false positive. Now, if we were carrying out market research at a 90% confidence level, which would be phenomenally good for most B2B market research, that means 1 in 10 of our market research will give us a false positive. In practice, we're lucky to get an 80% confidence level for most B2B market research, which means that 1 in 5 times we'll get a false positive. Carry out 2 pieces of market research, you've got a 0.8 times 0.8 to 0.64 in a chance of being right both times, which means you've got an over a 1/3 chance of getting a false positive. Do it 3 times, you've got a 1 in 2 chance of getting a false positive. In other words, false positives will happen in B2B market research because of type 1 errors. And if you do enough market research, they quite definitely will happen. How do we deal with that issue? And the answer is, you've any concerns about a false positive, replicate the market research. If we have an 80% chance of getting it right and therefore a 20% chance of a false positive, a type 1 error, if you do that research twice, the chances of getting 2 false positives in a row are 0.2 times 0.2, or roughly, close enough, 4%. In other words, negligible. So if you have any concerns about a type 1 error, and you should have concerns, replicate the market research. The next one is not using enough market research. One of the challenges we're running into at this stage is people will say, well, we did market research in 2018 or 2019, why can't we just use that? And the answer is, of course, COVID-19's brought us into a brave new world. And what customers said even last year, the latter half of last year, even January or February of this year, may be woefully out of date. So you need to make sure your market research is up to date, and chances are it isn't. Pardon me. The other issue in terms of market research is I occasionally meet people who say we can rely on the sales team. Well, sure enough, you can rely on the sales team to sell. Don't rely on them to carry out market research. That's not what they're trained to do, and it's not what they're expected to do. And typically, salespeople are just not that good at it. Great at selling, just not that good at market research. They run into a number of issues. The obvious one is if a customer articulates a problem, instead of just simply collecting the data so we can work on it, they start to come up with a solution from their particular company's armory of solutions, which may or may not be the right solution for the problem. But the bigger issue is that salespeople will carry out the market research and then lie about it. And I'm not saying they're evil or bad, but rather they tend to be biased. If a salesperson as a customer particularly wants a new product, they're naturally inclined to see that every customer wants that product. And they will overestimate or exaggerate the demand for this new product, hoping to ensure that we will indeed develop it and thereby keep their customer a happy customer. Equally, if they don't have any customers who want the product and they think you're setting quota levels, they will underestimate the demand for the product. Either way, they will fudge. And academic research shows that salespeople tend to fudge significantly. There's a 2016 study carried out over at, published in the Harvard Business Review in March 2016, that found that roughly 1/4 of salespeople overestimate just for typical products and 1/4 grossly underestimate. It'll be even worse for new products for all the reasons that I've stated. So don't rely on the salespeople to do the market research. It's our job as marketers to do it, or market researchers to do it, not our colleagues in sales. Rejecting failure. There's a natural temptation to only want new products that succeed. Information theory tells us we should look for a 50-50 chance of success when developing new products. That's a natural temptation to look just for successes and reject failure. The trouble with doing that is it means we don't take any risks, and we end up with very minor product enhancements, and we don't get any real home runs. That's a fairly self-explanatory one. I'm not going to spend much time on that. And lastly, failing to carry out a reality check. We can carry out market research, but always carry out that reality check. Ask yourselves the question, does the result from my market research, or the results from my market research, really make sense? Now, what we're all told at business school is make sure you get results from 2 independent sources. And that's doubtless true enough. The trouble is those independent sources are rarely truly independent. When I got my MBA from Columbia Business School, and I had a professor there called John Farley, and he told me a story I've never forgotten about market research and failing to run a reality check that I'd like to share with you now. He was researching a market, and he was called up by phone by a reporter from the Wall Street Journal who was writing an article about the market and knew that John Farley was researching it. And the reporter had all sorts of questions for Professor Farley, which Professor Farley answered. And then the reporter asked Professor Farley a question he did not know the answer to, which was, how fast is the market growing? And John Farley said, I don't know the answer to that question. But the reporter was not to be turned off. The reporter was convinced that John Farley was simply trying to avoid giving an answer to the question. And so she kept asking the question over and over again in different ways, until eventually, to get the reporter off the phone, John Farley plucked a number from thin air and said 15%. The market's growing at 15% a year. At that point, the reporter had an answer to a question, and that was the end of the interview, and John Farley could get back to his work. A little while later, he saw an interview of himself in the Wall Street Journal, in which he stated in the interview, the market was growing at 15% a year. And only John Farley knew that was a number he'd made up just to get a reporter off the phone. A little while later, he saw an article in a trade journal without attribution stating the market was growing at 15% a year. A report from the Department of Commerce stating it was growing 15% a year. Securities analysts claiming the market was growing at 15% a year. And sure enough, it became accepted wisdom in the industry that the market was going at 15% a year. And only John Farley knew it was a number he'd totally, utterly, and completely made up just to get a reporter off the phone. Does this kind of thing happen? More often than you might think. Now, on that occasion, I don't know anyone who lost money off it. I have another example, which if time permits, I'll share with you, which caused a lot of money to be lost. But I am aware of the passage of time. So, Lynn, I should ask you whether I should halt for questions now or give that additional example.
I think we'd like to hear that example, and then I'll field a couple questions.
Thank you, Lynn. I appreciate your courtesy. This is a famous example. So famous there's even been a TV show documentary on HBO made about it. And this, of course, is the story of Theranos out in California. And for those of you who need a quick refresh, here's how it goes. If any of you, or whenever any of you are asked to have a blood sample taken, you're probably all familiar with the fact that they stick a needle into a vein in your arm, and they take a couple of vials of blood, sometimes more than that, but at least a couple of vials. And this causes some minor, admittedly, patient discomfort. Elizabeth Holmes, the co-founder of Theranos, along with Ian Gibbons, a biochemist, thought, wouldn't it be a great idea if we could find a way just to use a finger stick, just 2 small droplets of blood? This would cause much less patient discomfort if we could find a way just to use 2 small droplets. And so they, after 10 years of hard work, they developed a diagnostic tool called the Edison. It just used 2 droplets of blood. It was backed by no less than 23 patents. So they started their work in 2003. They finished their work 10 years later in 2013. where they launched the product. And of course, people were very interested in this product. So much so that Walgreens, or to give the full name to the company, Walgreens Boots Alliance, decided, golly gosh, we've got to get an exclusive on this. And so they went over to Elizabeth Holmes, the CEO, and offered to pay the company, Theranos, $140 million in return for the exclusive right to set up wellness centers in their drugstores across the country. And so they set up drug wellness centers in their drugstores containing the Edison. And patients could go in, have 2 small droplets of blood taken, and a little while later they'd be told the results. And this machine could carry out, so Theranos claimed, over 140 different diagnostic tests: calcium, potassium, herpes, vitamin D, cancer, cholesterol, you name it, it could do it. There was only one little technical problem. The machine didn't actually work. The Wall Street Journal interviewed a journal called Tony Nugent, who is a Theranos engineer whose name is listed on no less than 5 of the Edison's patents. And he told the Wall Street Journal interviewer that he was really surprised that Walgreens had signed this agreement with Theranos because, and this is what the engineer said, it's still an experimental device, unquote, with an accuracy that was not to the level you'd want. That was a bit euphemistic. The accuracy was much worse than that. That same year, after Walgreens set up their wellness centers with the Edison machines in them, Theranos carried out some internal research where they tested a sample of blood with known constituents, and the Edison machines produced, or Edison machine, I should say, produced results as off by more than 2 standard deviations. Totally unacceptable. It gets worse. The Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services decided to pay a visit. Well, by this point, Theranos realized the machine wasn't actually working. And so they purchased some regular blood analyzers from Siemens, but the Siemens machines are designed to work with 2 vials of blood. And so all they did was dilute the finger sticks. The trouble is the Edison isn't designed to work with diluted blood, so it still gave faulty results. And they put the Siemens machines in the wellness centers at Walgreens as well as at their head office out in California. Well, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services inspectors showed up. They saw the Siemens machines and they worked. They didn't see the Edison machines because Theranos had locked all the Edison machines away in a separate room, which they never got to see. But they did leave behind some samples of real blood for Theranos to test. When they tested them on the Edison machines, potassium levels were so high, according to the Edison, the patients would have had to have been dead to produce the results they gave. In other words, the Edison didn't work. Now, poor Ian Gibbons kept working on this machine to try and get it to work. He kept working on it and working on it, but nothing was working. And he did something I strongly urge none of you ever to even think about doing, let alone actually commit. He got so caught up in the failure of the Edison machine to work properly that he took his own life. His widow, Rochelle, was interviewed by the Wall Street Journal, and she stated her husband took his own life, committed suicide, because nothing was working on the Edison machine. Now, please do not do that, ever. Don't even think about doing it ever. But that's what poor Ian Gibbons did. Now, news started to leak out, as you might expect, and in 2014, they had to cancel some of the results, and in 2015, all of the results produced by the Edison machines. As for poor Walgreens, they didn't even start trying to cancel their contract with Theranos and get their $140 million back till 2060. And that's a sad story for Walgreens. They never got their money back, in case you're wondering. But here's the bit about failing to carry out a reality check. In all this time, the good folks at Walgreens never once bothered to carry out a reality check. Before they signed the contract, after they signed the contract, they never bothered once to ask Theranos for a sample Edison machine so they could test it themselves and see if it actually worked. Whenever you carry out market research, wherever you're involved in product development, carry out a reality check. And ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed that example from Theranos. If you want to see more, there is a great documentary developed by HBO, which I encourage you to take a look at, as well as a great book written by a Wall Street Journal reporter, which I encourage you to read as well. Lynn, over to you.
Hey, thanks so much, Richard. These were fascinating. And You know, I always have said, if you can't be a good example, at least be a good warning to others. So there's these great stories of like what not. So now that I'm terrified about going forward with my market research and knowing that I must do something now because everything has changed around me. So I need to double check and triple check what I think I know. What do you, for the B2B researcher, think is like the first couple of things that I should do as I prepare to go back out and talk to my market?
First thing is very simple. You've got to get internal buy-in. Right now, if you're trying to use a budget, budget's under real pressure. Make sure you can get the budget. And that would be the first thing you have to do. You've got to get back up. Make sure you've got the time to do it. Secondly, because R&D and engineering budgets have been cut, if it's going to involve new product development, bear in mind we're going to see some slowdown in time to market in many areas. So if customers do articulate a problem, make sure that they understand it may take a little bit of time before you can actually start beta testing solutions. Once you've done that, my advice to you is definitely to identify the decision makers. A lot of customers have changed the decision makers. People have lamentably been furloughed or laid off. So the people you used to talk to may no longer be the right people to talk to. Their responsibilities may have changed. So make sure you've identified the decision makers, and that will be the next step. After that, then you can start to carry out the market research.
I think that really reminds me of, say, 2008, 9, and 10, when things were changing all along, and you'd be in the middle of a product development process for a customer, and then suddenly you wouldn't discover that person answering emails any longer because they were gone. So I do sense the challenge of finding the decision maker, or the decision maker that keeps being moved around because the other company is trying to figure out how to get their footing even now. So yeah, very risky to use any of your funds, if you can find them, if you're not actually sure the decision maker is going to be intact, or the company isn't going to change their mind after the development work. Yep, that's the caution. So, so Richard, I really appreciate everything that you've said here. I want to make sure that folks know that they can get to you through Treitel.com and Treitel@Treitel.com, right? If they have questions, or they can contact us at ISBM, and feel free to send us more questions. We'll send them over to Richard. Thank you so very, very much for your time. Really appreciate this. I'll remind everyone that this is available for review in about 24 hours on our site. And I hope that you'll share it with others, and feel free to reach out to Richard too. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And you stay safe. Richard's in New York, and he's like the only person left, I think. The else is left town.
Indeed, indeed.
All right, everybody stay safe.